Chapter 1. The Ghost Girl's Hope. The lye soap bit into the raw skin of Nadia's knuckles. Scrub, rinse, wring. It was the rhythm of her life, a constant dull beat against the silence. The scent of boiled linens and damp stone clung to the air in the laundry room, a smell so familiar it was like a part of her. It was the perfume of the invisible. She kept her eyes down, always down, focused on the worn wooden floorboards. Looking up was an invitation for trouble, and trouble always found her. Her world was a small gray bubble, and as long as she stayed quiet, as long as she didn't make a sound, she could survive. A burst of laughter shattered her fragile peace. 3 she-wolves sauntered in, their movements full of the easy confidence she'd only ever dreamed of. Alara, the pack beta's daughter, led them. Her eyes, sharp as flint, landed on Nadia. A slow, cruel smile spread across her lips. "Look what we have here," Alara purred, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "It's the ghost girl, still trying to scrub away the stain of being you?" Her friends, Lyra and Kaylee, giggled. The sound was like glass crunching under a boot. Nadia's shoulders hunched. She didn't look up. She just kept scrubbing, her motions becoming frantic. "Don't cry. Don't let them see you cry." It was a prayer she'd whispered 1,000 times. "Oh, leave it alone, Alara," Lyra said, though there was no kindness in her tone. "You can't talk to something that isn't there." The words were a physical blow. They struck a place deep inside her, a bruised and broken part that remembered another voice, colder and sharper than any of these. Her mother's voice from a long, long time ago. "You were a mistake, a silent, worthless thing. The moon goddess looks away from you." A phantom ache spread through Nadia's chest. The memory was a splinter of ice lodged near her heart, one that never fully melted. Alara leaned in close, her scent of cheap floral perfume making Nadia's stomach churn. "Is it true you haven't spoken a single word since your mother left? That's just pathetic." Suddenly, the main door to the hall slammed open. Alpha Marcus of the Shadow Creek Pack strode in, his presence demanding immediate silence. His gaze swept the room, dismissive of the Omegas, his focus on the announcement he was about to make. His voice boomed, bouncing off the stone walls. "Listen up. The annual mate-claiming ceremony is in 2 nights. This year is different." A current of excitement shot through the room. Alara and her friends straightened up, their eyes gleaming. Marcus let the tension build before continuing. "This year, the ceremony will be presided over by the Alpha King himself, King Silas." The name fell like a boulder into a still pond. Gasps rippled through the assembled wolves. The Alpha King. He was a legend, a nightmare. A ruler of unmatched power who hadn't been seen at a regional claiming in years. Rumors said he was cursed, that his heart was a stone, that he'd never claim a mate. And in the deepest, most secret part of Nadia's soul, a tiny, impossible flower of hope began to bloom. The goddess. She was the mother of all wolves. She saw everyone, even the broken ones, even the silent ones. What if the thought was so fragile, so dangerous? It was a butterfly in a hurricane. She could feel the familiar weight of dread rushing in to crush it. A girl like her? A silent Omega with nothing to offer? It was a joke. It was a fantasy. Alara's sneering voice cut through her thoughts as if she could read them. "Don't even think about it, ghost girl." She laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "Can you imagine? The great Alpha King wanting a mute little mouse like you?" The others joined in, their laughter a storm that threatened to tear her apart. Nadia's hands stilled in the water. The soap slipped from her numb fingers. She squeezed her eyes shut, the laughter echoing in the darkness. But behind the pain, behind the humiliation, that tiny, stupid flower of hope refused to be completely crushed. It unfurled one more petal. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. For the first time in a long time, she would choose to be seen, even if it meant being destroyed. Chapter 2. The King of Ash and Bone. The coppery scent of fresh blood was starting to fade, replaced by the cold, sterile smell of fear. It lingered in the throne room, clinging to the tapestries and the stone floor like a shroud. Silas sat on his throne of obsidian and iron, his fingers steepled before him. He wasn't relaxed. He was never relaxed. He was a king carved from granite and fury, and his kingdom was built on control. The traitor's last gurgling breath was still a faint echo in the vast, silent chamber. It was a necessary sound, a reminder. Weakness was a disease, and he was the cure. His beta, a grizzled old wolf named Lucian, approached the dais. His steps were heavy, measured. He was the only one who dared approach the king after a judgment. "The traitor's cell has been searched, my king," Lucian said, his voice a low rumble. "We found correspondence. It seems the Crimson Fang Pack was behind the attempt on your life." Silas's golden eyes remained fixed on the roaring fireplace across the room. The flames danced and writhed, hungry and wild. "They are gnats, Lucian. Annoying, but easily crushed. Send a legion. I want their alpha's head on a spike before the next full moon." "It will be done." Lucian hesitated, a rare sign of unease. "My king..." The council grows restless. This is the third attempt in as many years. They speak of instability. They whisper that the kingdom needs a queen. A low growl vibrated in Silas's chest, a dangerous tremor that made the very air feel heavy. His gaze snapped to Lucian, and the old wolf flinched. "A queen?" The words were quiet, but laced with venom. "You mean a weakness, a vulnerability, a soft spot for my enemies to stick a knife in." A flicker of memory, sharp and unwanted, pierced his control. A different woman, with eyes like emeralds and a smile like poison. The sting of betrayal, so potent it felt fresh even after all these years. His first and only bond, shattered. She had taught him a valuable lesson. Love was a fool's game, and he would not be made a fool again. His wolf paced restlessly inside him, snarling at the memory. The beast wanted a mate, its primal instincts demanding a partner, a queen to rule beside him. But the man, the king, knew better. Lucian bowed his head, knowing he had pushed too far. He changed the subject, pulling a formal scroll from his tunic. "There is another matter, Alpha, a formal request. Your presence is required at the Shadow Creek Pack's mate-claiming ceremony." Silas let out a short, harsh laugh. "A parade of desperate she-wolves, all vying for a crown they couldn't possibly bear. Why would I subject myself to such a pathetic display?" "It is tradition," Lucian insisted gently. "A show of strength. It would reassure your people." Silas snatched the scroll from Lucian's hand, his fingers tight on the parchment. He was about to burn it in the fireplace to send a clear message to all the hopefuls. But as his fingers brushed the wax seal, it happened. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up his arm. The throne room dissolved. He was no longer in his castle of stone and shadow. He was somewhere else. A forest clearing, bathed in moonlight. And a scent. A scent he had never known before. It was wild lavender and rain and something achingly pure. It wrapped around him, pulling at something deep within his soul. A bond. No, the promise of a bond. Thrummed in his blood, a violent, undeniable pull towards her. He didn't see a face. He didn't hear a name. He only felt a desperate, suffocating need. It was a call from the moon goddess herself. He gasped, the vision vanishing as quickly as it came. The scroll fell from his numb fingers. A guttural snarl ripped from his throat, echoing in the cavernous room. Lucian took a step back, his eyes wide with shock. Silas was on his feet, his fists clenched, his perfect control shattered. The goddess was playing a game. She was trying to force his hand. Rage, cold and absolute, washed over him. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. A terrifying flicker of curiosity. Who was this woman? Who was this soul the goddess had dared to tie to his own? He would go to this pathetic ceremony, he would find this female, and he would show the moon goddess and this fated mate that he was a king who would not be controlled. Chapter 3. The Path of Thorns. The dress was gray, not silver, not even a soft dove gray. It was the color of dishwater, of a sky heavy with unshed rain. It was the only dress Nadia owned that wasn't patched or stained, and as she held its rough-spun fabric in her trembling hands, it felt more like a burial shroud than a gown for a ceremony. From beyond the thin walls of her tiny attic room, she could hear the sounds of celebration, excited chatter, bursts of laughter, the thrum of music starting up in the distance. They were all so happy, so full of hope. For Nadia, hope was a dangerous poison. Her mind was a storm. Don't go. They'll only laugh at you. You're the ghost girl, the mute, the mistake. Her mother's cruel words were a constant whisper in the back of her mind, a venomous lullaby she'd lived with for years. She remembered the weight of her mother's disappointment, a crushing force that had stolen her voice and taught her to live in the shadows. To wish for more was to invite more pain. But then, another thought pushed through the fear. A fragile, desperate question. What if she sees me? The moon goddess. She was the mother to all, the one who chose the paths of their hearts. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't see a broken toy. Maybe she saw something worth saving. The thought was enough. It was a single flickering candle in an endless night. Nadia pulled the gray dress over her head. The clearing was a dizzying assault on her senses. Torches threw dancing shadows on the grass, their flames crackling and spitting. The air was thick with the scent of pine and roasting meat, mingled with the nervous, excited musk of dozens of different wolves. Laughter and music swirled around her, a chaotic symphony that made her head spin. She tried to melt into the edge of the crowd, to become just another shadow among the trees. Invisibility was her shield, her only defense. But the shield wasn't strong enough tonight. Well, I can't believe it actually showed up. Ilara's voice, sharp and mocking, cut through the noise. She and her friends formed a half circle around Nadia, trapping her against the trunk of an old oak tree. Their pretty dresses were a stark contrast to Nadia's drab gray. They looked like bright, beautiful flowers, and she was a weed to be plucked. "What are you doing here, ghost girl?" Lyra sneered, looking her up and down with disgust. "Did you really think the Alpha King would want that?" She gestured to Nadia's entire being with a dismissive flick of her wrist. Nadia's throat closed up. She wanted to run. She wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, and she bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Just as a single tear was about to escape, a change occurred. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden absence of it. The music faltered, the chatter died, the laughter choked off. A palpable wave of energy, cold, immense, and utterly dominant, washed over the clearing. It silenced every voice, stilled every movement. It was pure, undiluted power. The very air grew heavy, charged with an ancient authority that demanded submission. A whisper started at the far end of the clearing, a sound so faint it was barely a breath. It traveled through the crowd like a ripple, passed from wolf to wolf, a single, awe-filled, terrified phrase. "The king. He's here." Nadia's heart, which had been cowering in her chest, began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breath caught. Against her will, her head lifted. She looked past Ilara's stunned face, across the sea of suddenly still bodies, to the entrance of the clearing. And she saw him, the Alpha King. He was a figure of shadow and moonlight, a walking storm of power and darkness. And for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, his golden eyes seemed to sweep the crowd and land directly on her. Chapter 4. The King's Gaze. The king's power was a physical weight, pressing down on the clearing, choking the laughter and music from the air. Nadia felt it like a hand on her chest, stealing her breath. He stood on the ceremonial platform, a figure carved from shadow and rage, his golden eyes sweeping across the rows of hopeful she-wolves. Every female he passed straightened, trying to catch his attention, offering silent pleas with their eyes. But his expression remained unchanged. He looked bored. He looked empty. It was the look of a predator surveying a field of mice, unimpressed and hungry for something more. Nadia tried to shrink, to fold into herself until she was nothing but a speck of dust on the forest floor. He can't see me. If I don't move, if I don't breathe, he won't see me. It was a foolish prayer. The silence stretched, becoming thin and brittle. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Even Alara and her friends had fallen silent, their petty cruelty forgotten in the face of this immense, terrifying presence. Then his gaze stopped. It was like the world had tilted on its axis. His eyes, burning like twin suns, locked onto hers. They didn't just see her. They felt like they were peeling back her skin, looking straight into the tattered mess of her soul. The boredom in his stare vanished, replaced by a violent, shocking intensity. It was disbelief. It was fury. It was recognition. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Who was he looking at? Why was the great Alpha King staring at the ghost girl from Shadow Creek? Alara followed his line of sight. When she realized it was Nadia he was focused on, a harsh, ugly laugh escaped her lips. Him? Staring at her? She scoffed, her voice unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. Don't be ridiculous. She's a mute. She hasn't spoken a word in 10 years. Another voice from her pack chimed in, a cruel, eager whisper. She's broken. Everyone knows it. Useless. An embarrassment to our pack. The words were stones, sharp and heavy, thrown at her in front of everyone. Each one struck a fresh bruise on her heart. She flinched, the shame a hot wave that washed over her from head to toe. This was her nightmare come to life. To be seen, only to be publicly destroyed. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing for the ground to swallow her, praying for his gaze to move on, to dismiss her as worthless just like everyone else. But it didn't. She could still feel it, a burning pressure against her eyelids. The attention didn't waver. Instead, it intensified. Then, a new sound cut through the whispers. It was low, guttural, and full of a terrifying, ancient rage. It was the sound of a great beast stirring, of a predator whose patience had just run out. A rumbling, possessive growl echoed through the clearing. It wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at them. Chapter 5. The Unwanted Fate. It was her. The scent from the vision, wild lavender and storm-tossed air, poured from the small female cowering at the edge of the crowd. It was a beacon, a siren's call to his soul that drowned out everything else. Silas felt a wave of cold fury wash through him. Her? This was the one the goddess had chosen for him? A trembling wisp of a thing in a drab gray dress with wide, terrified eyes and the posture of a kicked dog. She was weakness personified. She was everything he had sworn to never allow in his life, in his court, in his bed. His wolf, however, had other ideas. The beast was a raging inferno in his chest. Mate, ours, protect her, claim her, now. The primal command was a roar in his mind, so powerful it threatened to shatter his iron control. He fought it, his knuckles white where he gripped the arm of his throne. He was Silas, the Alpha King. He ruled his wolf, his kingdom, his own damn fate. He would not be chained to this frightened little mouse. Then he heard them, the whispers from the she-wolves beside her. Mute, broken, useless. Every insult was a lash against his pride. Every sneer was a challenge to his authority. They were speaking of his fate, of the female the goddess herself had tied to his soul. They were calling his mate worthless. His control didn't just snap, it vaporized. The possessive growl ripped from his throat, a promise of violence that silenced the entire clearing. His body moved before his mind could command it. He was off the platform, striding through the crowd. The wolves scrambled out of his path, a sea of fear parting before him. He saw none of them. His world had narrowed to a single point, the girl with the stormy eyes and the scent of home. She had her eyes squeezed shut, her face chalk white. She thought his rage was for her, the foolish little thing. He stopped directly in front of her. The scent was dizzying, a drug that made his head spin and his fangs ache. His wolf clawed at him, demanding he mark her, claim her, end this agony of waiting. He forced his hand up, his movements stiff. He saw her flinch as he reached for her, and it sent a fresh spike of rage through him. Not at her, but at whoever had taught her to expect pain from a touch. He forced his fingers to be gentle as they cupped her chin, tilting her face up to his. "Open your eyes," he commanded, his voice a low rasp. They fluttered open. They were gray, the color of a winter sky, and swimming with a fear so deep it stole his breath. But beneath the terror, he saw it. A tiny, resilient spark. A flicker of a soul that had been battered, but not extinguished. And in that instant, the fight went out of him. Fate was a cruel, relentless bitch, and she had won. He looked over her head, his gaze sweeping over the sneering she-wolves, the dumbfounded Alpha Marcus, and the entire shocked assembly. He let the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of his decision. When he spoke, his voice was calm, absolute, and carried to every corner of the clearing. "She is mine." For a heartbeat, there was only stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted. Gasps turned into outraged shouts. Alpha Marcus finally found his voice and took a stumbling step forward, his face purple with fury. "My king, you can't be serious. She is nothing, a mute, a worthless—" Silas didn't even have to raise his voice. He simply turned his head and leveled a gaze on the lesser Alpha. It was a look that promised a slow, painful, and very public death. Marcus's words choked in his throat, and he fell back as if he'd been physically struck. The challenge had been made. Now he would answer it. Chapter 6. The Mark of the King. She is mine. The 3 words echoed in the buzzing, empty space of Nadia's mind. They were a sentence that made no sense, a puzzle with no solution. The Alpha King stood before her, the center of a storm of his own making, and his thumb was drawing soft, maddening circles on her skin. All around them, the world was a blur of noise. Shouts, horrified gasps, the furious face of her own Alpha. None of it felt real. The king's scent was a forest after a fire, pine, smoke, and the electric hum of a coming storm. It was overwhelming, filling her lungs, clouding her thoughts. His touch was a brand, sending a cascade of confusing sparks through her veins. He was real. This was happening. He had looked at all the perfect, beautiful, confident she-wolves, and he had chosen the broken one. He had chosen her. The thought was so impossible it bordered on madness. A few males from other packs, their chests puffed with pride and disbelief, began to move. Their alphas tried to hold them back, but the insult was too great. The king choosing an omega? A silent one? It was a slight against them all, a disruption of the natural order. Alara was staring, her jaw slack, her face a comical mask of shock, envy, and pure, unadulterated hatred. The king paid them no mind. He leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear, and his voice was a low, dangerous rumble meant only for her. "They doubt me," he murmured, his breath a warm shock against her cold skin. "They doubt my choice. We will give them a reason to fear instead." There was no warmth in his tone, no affection. This was not a tender claiming. It was a statement of power, a move in a game she didn't understand. Before she could even try to process his words, his hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck. He tilted her head to the side, baring the delicate skin above her collarbone. Pure, animal panic seized her. Her muscles locked. A scream built in her throat, the first sound in a decade, but it died before it could find air. No, not like this. Please. His lips pressed against the frantic pulse in her neck, a soft, almost gentle touch that was a lie. Then she felt the sharp prick of his fangs. It wasn't just pain. It was fire. It was lightning shot directly into her soul. It was a billion stars exploding behind her eyes. A bond, ancient and irrevocable, snapped violently into place, weaving his soul into hers. The connection was a raging torrent, flooding her with his emotions, his cold fury, his deep-seated confusion, his shocking loneliness, and beneath it all, a wave of raw, untamed possession that was focused entirely on her. It was agony. It was ecstasy. It was too much. A collective gasp went through the crowd as the king lifted his head, leaving his bloody mark on her skin for all to see. The nascent challenges died instantly. The deal was sealed. She was his. The world began to spin, the edges of her vision turning dark. The force of the bond, the sheer scale of his power pouring into her was shattering her. Her legs buckled. The ground rushed up to meet her. But she never hit it. Strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against a chest as hard and unyielding as a mountain. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her completely was the king's blazing golden eyes. They were a vortex of conflict, of rage, and of something that looked terrifyingly like triumph. He had claimed her. He had chained her to him. And as he lifted her effortlessly into his arms and turned his back on the life she had always known, she had the distinct feeling that he had not saved her at all. He had just captured her. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. Nadia woke to the unfamiliar feeling of silk against her skin. For a confused moment, she thought she was dreaming. The ceiling above her was a carved masterpiece of dark wood, not the rough, splintered beams of her attic room. Then, memory returned in a brutal, dizzying rush. The ceremony, the king's voice, the fire of his mark. She instinctively touched her neck. A tender, raised knot of flesh met her fingers. A brand. His brand. In the quiet space of her mind, a low, steady hum persisted. It was the bond, a constant, unnerving awareness of the king's presence somewhere within the massive stone walls of his fortress. The heavy oak door swung open without a knock. An older she-wolf with a face like a sour plum entered, her movements sharp and efficient. "I am Helga," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "I am in charge of the queen's household." The title sounded like an insult on her tongue. "You will bathe. Then you will dress. The king expects you to be presentable." Helga laid out a gown of deep blue velvet on the enormous bed. It was more beautiful than anything Nadia had ever seen, adorned with silver thread that glittered like captured starlight. It felt like a costume, a disguise for a part she didn't know how to play. As the old wolf fussed around her, Nadia drifted to the tall, arched window. The castle grounds were a breathtaking expanse of manicured gardens and ancient trees, but a formidable black iron wall encircled the entire property. It was a beautiful prison, a gilded cage. The old feeling of worthlessness washed over her. A little gray mouse dressed in royal blue. What was she doing here? She saw the judgment in the eyes of the servants who scurried past, their gazes sliding off her as if she were a ghost. But then, something else stirred within her, a small, hard kernel of defiance. Her years of being invisible had taught her to see things others missed. She noticed the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in Helga's hand as she poured water, the way a guard in the hallway shifted his weight to favor a sore leg. These were details. Details could be important. Later that afternoon, the king entered her chambers. He moved with a predatory grace that sucked all the air from the room. His golden eyes swept over her, taking in the rich gown, the way it hung on her thin frame. He hadn't said a single word to her since the claiming, and the silence was a crushing weight. He stopped just a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. "You will be presented to the court this evening," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "You will stand at my side. You are not to speak unless I command it. You will not embarrass me." He took another step, closing the space between them. His scent, pine and storm and cold power, was overwhelming. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that chilled her to the bone. "And make no mistake," he snarled, his eyes boring into hers. "My claiming you was not an act of tenderness. You are a symbol, a message to my enemies. You are my property now, nothing more." Chapter 8. The Spark of Defiance. The great hall buzzed with the whispers of the vipers and sycophants Silas called his court. He stood on the dais, a chalice of wine in his hand, a mask of cold indifference on his face. Beside him, his new queen stood stiffly, a statue carved from fear. He could feel her terror through the bond, a frantic hummingbird pulse beneath his own skin. It was irritating. He scanned the crowd, his eyes narrowed. He saw the disdainful looks, the curled lips, the mocking glances they shot at Nadia when they thought he wasn't looking. A low growl rumbled in his chest. They weren't just mocking her. They were mocking him. They were questioning his power, his judgment. A high-born female, Lady Isolde, glided towards them. Her lineage was ancient, and her ambition was as sharp as her tongue. She gave Nadia a look of utter contempt before sinking into a curtsy that was an insult in its perfection. "Your Majesty," she purred to Silas, her voice like honey laced with poison. She didn't even acknowledge Nadia's presence. "The court is surprised by your choice. We had all hoped for a queen with a lineage strong enough to secure the throne for generations to come." The jab was obvious, a direct challenge wrapped in polite words. Silas felt his wolf surge, ready to tear the insolent she-wolf apart for her audacity. He opened his mouth to deliver a verbal lashing that would strip the flesh from her bones. But he paused. He looked at the little Omega beside him. He saw her tremble. He expected her to shrink, to cower, to prove them all right. A bitter wave of disappointment washed over him, but Nadia didn't shrink. She took a small, shaky breath. She lifted her chin, her small frame seeming to gain a strange new strength. And then, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, hoarse from years of disuse, but in the suddenly silent hall, it carried like a clear bell. "A strong lineage does not guarantee a strong heart, Lady Isolde," she said, her steady gray eyes meeting the other woman's shocked gaze. "And the throne is already secure. It has a king." The entire court froze. A collective, stunned silence fell over the hall. Lady Isolde stood speechless, her face draining of all color. Silas stared at his mate. He felt a jolt through the bond, not her usual fear, but a surge of wild, defiant pride. He had expected a mouse. He had not expected claws. Against his will, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his lips. Later that night, he found her in the vast, shadowed library. She was running her fingers over the spine of an old book. He moved silently, cornering her between two towering shelves, blocking her only escape. "That was a reckless display," he growled, his voice low and intimate in the quiet space. He was so close now he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her skin. Her heart was hammering in her chest. He could feel it through the bond. "But you were not afraid of her," he stated. It wasn't a question. He leaned in closer, his golden eyes boring into hers, demanding an answer. "Why?" Chapter 9. A Taste of Poison. The air between them had been thick with unspoken questions for days. Since their encounter in the library, Silas watched her with a new, unsettling intensity. Nadia felt like a puzzle he was determined to solve. It was terrifying. And for the first time in her life, it made her feel real. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but now it was mingled with a strange, thrilling spark of something else, something that felt dangerously like power. Tonight was a formal dinner with the king's inner council. They were a collection of grizzled, powerful alphas with hard eyes and scars that told stories of countless battles. They sat around the grand mahogany table, their gazes sharp and assessing as they looked at her. She was an unwelcome intruder in their world of politics and war. She sat beside Silas, a silent doll in a pretty dress, trying to make herself as small as possible. A servant in royal livery moved around the table, pouring wine from a heavy silver decanter. As he filled Nadia's goblet, a faint, familiar scent drifted towards her. It was bitter, like almonds, almost completely hidden by the rich aroma of the wine. Her blood ran cold. It was the same odd smell she had noticed lingering by the hearth in her chambers just 2 days ago. Wolfsbane. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. It was poison, in her cup, meant for her. Her eyes darted around the table, from the stern face of the general to the calculating stare of the king's treasurer. Any one of them could want her gone. Her whole life, she had survived by being invisible, by noticing the things that others overlooked. That quiet observation had just saved her life. She had to do something. But what? If she cried out, they would dismiss her as a hysterical, foolish Omega. Silas was deep in a heated debate with his general, his attention focused entirely on matters of state. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Taking a shaky breath, she reached for her goblet. With a small, seemingly clumsy movement, she knocked it over. Deep red wine spilled across the pristine white tablecloth like a splash of fresh blood. A few of the council members grunted in annoyance. Silas turned to her, his face a mask of cold fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he snarled, his voice dangerously low. Before Nadia could stammer out a reply, one of the king's hounds, a massive beast trained to detect poisons, padded out from under the table. It began to whine, its nose twitching as it lapped at the spreading crimson stain. A moment later, the hound let out a choked cry. Its body convulsed violently, and then it fell still. A dead, absolute silence fell over the room. Poison. The spilled wine was poisoned, and it had been meant for her. Silas's anger vanished, replaced by a terrifying, murderous rage that seemed to make the very air grow cold. He was on his feet in an instant, his heavy chair crashing backwards onto the marble floor. He shoved the massive table aside as if it were a child's toy and yanked her behind him, shielding her with his body. His golden eyes, blazing with lethal intent, swept across the shocked faces of his most trusted advisors. A low, deadly growl ripped from his chest, a sound that promised a slow and brutal death. "Whoever did this," he roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the table, "will pray for a death that I will not grant them." His eyes never left his counsel, but his hand found hers, his grip like a steel manacle. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of ownership, of a king whose property had been threatened, and he was ready to burn his entire kingdom down to find the culprit. Chapter 10. The Heat of the Blade. The air in the training yard was hot and smelled of dust and sweat. Since the poisoning attempt, Silas was haunted by a cold, unfamiliar dread. It wasn't for himself. It was for her, his mate. The thought was a foreign, unwelcome thing, but it was there nonetheless. He had decided she would not be a helpless target cowering behind his throne. She would learn to fight. He would teach her himself. "Again," he commanded, his voice a harsh bark. Nadia stumbled forward, swinging the blunted training dagger in a clumsy arc. He sidestepped it easily, his frustration mounting. She was hesitant, her movements tangled in a lifetime of fear. "You're thinking too much," he snarled, knocking the blade from her hand. It clattered on the packed earth. "In a real fight, you'd be dead. Stop thinking. React." He could feel her emotions through the bond, a sharp sting of humiliation, a deep well of frustration, and beneath it all, a stubborn, gritty determination that refused to break. He was being hard on her, pushing her until she was trembling with exhaustion. It was a mistake to be this close to her. Her scent, wild lavender and the clean smell of her skin, was a constant distraction, a fire licking at the edges of his control. Every time he stepped in to adjust her stance, his hands on her waist, his body brushing against hers, the wolf inside him roared with possessive fire. He told himself it was the bond, a simple, primal instinct. But it was a lie. He was drawn to the flicker of defiance he saw in her stormy eyes, the quiet strength that had faced down a viper like Lady Isolde. She was more than just his mate, she was captivating. "Again!" he roared, lunging at her. This time, something was different. She didn't retreat. She didn't flinch. As he moved in, she twisted, her body flowing with a sudden, startling grace. She used his own momentum against him, a move he had shown her only once. Before he could react, he felt the cold, hard press of the training dagger against his throat. They froze. They were chest to chest, tangled together in the center of the yard. Her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning flicker of triumph. He could feel the frantic, wild beating of her heart against his ribs. Or perhaps it was his own. The world narrowed to the few inches between them, to the scent of her, the heat of her, the victory in her eyes. Her lips parted on a silent gasp. His control, which had been stretched thin for days, finally snapped. He lowered his head, his mouth hovering a breath away from hers. He saw her eyes flutter closed, a silent invitation. But then, a memory slammed into him, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Emerald eyes, a beautiful lying smile, the agony of betrayal, a harsh growl ripped from his chest. He shoved her away from him, stumbling back as if he'd been burned. "The lesson is over," he snarled, his voice rough with an emotion he refused to name. He turned his back on her, striding away from the training yard, leaving her alone and trembling in the sudden, crackling silence. Chapter 11. The Bitterest Truth. The almost kiss had left a humming, dangerous energy in the air between them. Silas was a storm of conflicting emotions, his mood swinging from icy distance to a simmering, possessive intensity that made Nadia's skin prickle. She was in the gardens trying to find a moment of peace when Lucian, the king's beta, approached her. His old, kind eyes were filled with a deep, sorrowful pity. "My queen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The investigation into the poisoning, it has revealed something. I believe you have a right to see it." A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She followed him through the castle, down winding stone staircases, into a part of the fortress she had never seen. He led her into a small, secure chamber, the air thick with the smell of old parchment and cold iron. On a simple wooden table lay a single letter. Lucian pushed it towards her. The handwriting was a delicate, looping script. It was elegant. It was beautiful. And it was familiar. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. It was her mother's. With trembling fingers, Nadia picked it up and began to read. The words were a venom that seeped into her soul. It was a letter to the Alpha of the Crimson Fang Pack, Silas's sworn enemies. It was a bargain, a contract. Her mother hadn't just left her. She had sold her. She had promised her silent, worthless daughter to the enemy Alpha in exchange for a new life, a title and a bag of gold. The rejection, the cruel words, the years of being treated like a ghost. It hadn't been because Nadia was a mistake. It had all been a lie. A calculated, cruel performance designed to make her seem so broken, so worthless, that no one in her own pack would care when she was given away. She wasn't born unworthy. She had been deliberately crushed to make her seem that way. The world shattered. The years of silent grief, of shame, of believing she was a flaw in the goddess's plan. It all curdled into a white-hot volcanic rage. The pain in her heart didn't just ache. It exploded. The sound that tore from her throat was not a scream of a victim. It was the roar of a she-wolf who had just been handed a blade. The door to the chamber burst open. Silas stood there, his eyes wild, drawn by the furious, violent emotion he must have felt through the bond. He saw the letter in her hand, saw the murderous fury in her eyes, and a look of grim understanding crossed his face. Nadia looked up at him, her body trembling not with fear, but with a terrifying newfound power. "She will not win," Nadia whispered, her voice low and laced with steel. "I was never silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was waiting, and I will never, ever be powerless again." Chapter 12. A Queen of Storms. The trembling mouse was gone. In her place stood a wolf. Silas watched as Nadia moved through the castle in the days that followed the revelation. Her grief was a sharp, dangerous edge, and her rage was a silent, controlled inferno that burned in the depths of her gray eyes. She walked with a new purpose, a confidence that was so profound it set the entire court on edge. She was no longer a ghost, she was a presence, and the court fought back. The whispers grew louder, more vicious. Now they saw her as the daughter of a traitor, a snake born from a snake. "Like mother, like daughter," he heard one of the lords mutter as she passed. The threats became more direct. A heavy stone gargoyle crumbled from a parapet, landing just inches from where she was walking. The girth on her horse's saddle was sliced nearly all the way through, discovered only moments before she was set to ride. A cold, possessive fury became Silas's constant companion. He doubled her personal guard, his orders sharp and laced with deadly promises of what would happen if she were harmed. He watched her navigate the nest of vipers he called his court, and he was stunned. She didn't cower from their sneers. She met their gazes with a cold, unwavering stare that promised consequences. She began to speak at council meetings, her voice quiet but firm, her observations startlingly astute. Her life in the shadows had made her a master of noticing the small, important details, the flicker of fear in a courtier's eyes, the slight tremor in a general's hand. He found himself seeking her counsel, valuing her insight. The dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer king and captive. They were allies, bound by a shared danger. He realized with a jolt that he was no longer afraid of her weakness. He was terrified of losing the incredible strength he saw growing in her every day. She wasn't just his mate, she was becoming his queen. One evening, Lucian burst into his study, his face grim. "The poisoner has talked," the old wolf said, his voice low. "He has named his accomplice, the one who gave him the wolfsbane, the one who told him when and where to strike." Silas stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "Who?" he demanded, the single word a low growl. Lucian's eyes were filled with a grim certainty. It was Lady Isolde. Of course, the ambitious she-wolf who had insulted Nadia at her own presentation. A cold satisfaction settled in Silas's gut. But it was fleeting. Isolde was a pawn, not a player. She wasn't smart enough to orchestrate this on her own. He looked at Lucian, a new, deadly hunt beginning in his eyes. "Who does she serve?" he asked, already striding towards the door. He had to find Nadia. This game had just become far more dangerous. Chapter 13. The Queen's Gambit. The grand ballroom glittered with the light of 1,000 candles, but the atmosphere was as sharp and cold as glass. Every smile was a mask, every polite greeting a potential lie. Silas had told her the plan. They knew Lady Isolde was a traitor, but they needed to force the hand of the master she served. Nadia stood beside him, clad in a gown the color of spilled wine, the fabric cool against her skin. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, but for the first time she did not want to hide. She felt ready. Silas stepped forward, his voice silencing the orchestra and the nervous chatter. "I have found the one who dared to poison my queen," he announced, his voice echoing off the marble columns. He named the captured servant, then held up a heavy bag of gold. "This is for anyone who can provide the names of his co-conspirators. Speak now, or face my wrath when I uncover the truth myself." It was a trap, and Nadia watched it spring. She saw the flicker of sheer panic in Lady Isolde's eyes. She saw the way her gaze darted, for just a fraction of a second, to a man standing near the hearth. Lord Valerius, a respected member of Silas's own council, a wolf who had advised the king for years. A cold certainty settled in Nadia's gut. It's him. Through the bond, she felt Silas's own fury spike as he followed her gaze. He was about to act to call out the Lord, but Nadia knew it would be a mistake. A king's accusation without proof was tyranny. The accusation had to come from a place he couldn't defend against. It had to come from her. She stepped forward, her movement drawing the attention of the entire court. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the tension with perfect clarity. "Lady Isolde," she said, her eyes locking with the terrified woman's, "you seem unwell." Nadia let the silence stretch. "I was just admiring the flower in your hair. It is a nightshade orchid, is it not? Very rare." She paused, then turned her gaze to the Lord by the fire. "In fact, I believe the only place it grows in this entire kingdom is in Lord Valerius's private greenhouse." The connection was thin, but it was enough. It was a single thread that unraveled everything. Lady Isolde let out a choked sob. Lord Valerius's mask of calm shattered. With a snarl, he lunged not at Nadia but at Isolde, a wicked-looking dagger suddenly appearing in his hand. He meant to silence his accomplice, but Silas was a blur of motion, intercepting the treacherous lord and slamming him to the floor as the royal guards swarmed them. Later, after the chaos had subsided, Silas found her on a quiet balcony. He came to stand behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. He said nothing, simply turned her to face him. His golden eyes were blazing with an emotion she had never seen before. Not just possession, not just pride, but a raw, stunning awe. "You," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You are my queen." And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle exploration. It was a storm, a flash flood, a desperate and unstoppable claiming. It was the release of every unspoken word, every ounce of tension, every spark of desire that had been building between them. It was the kiss of a king who had finally truly found his queen. Chapter 14. An excuse for war. The kiss had ignited the bond between them, transforming it from a humming connection into a roaring inferno. The desire Silas had fought for so long was now a living thing, a wild and powerful fire in his blood. But the world would not grant them a moment's peace. Lord Valerius had confessed. He was a spy for the Crimson Fang Pack, feeding their alpha, Gregor, information from within the court. The plan had been to assassinate Nadia, frame another lord, and plunge the kingdom into a civil war, leaving it vulnerable to invasion. Just as the sun began to rise, a messenger on a foam-flecked horse galloped into the castle courtyard. He was bleeding, exhausted, and he carried a declaration from Gregor himself. Silas read the parchment, his knuckles white. It was a public condemnation, an open call for rebellion. Gregor declared him an unfit king, a weakling who had defiled his throne by choosing a traitor's daughter, a worthless mute Omega as his queen. He was using Nadia as a weapon, twisting her past into an excuse to rally other packs to his cause. A cold, deadly rage, deeper than any he had ever known, settled in Silas's heart. They dared to call her weak? They dared to use her name as a battle cry against him? He looked at Nadia, who had read the declaration over his shoulder. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a hard, unyielding strength that took his breath away. She met his gaze, her own voice steady and clear. "I will not be your weakness," she said. "I will not be the reason they destroy this kingdom." In that moment, the last of his old walls crumbled. The ghost of his past betrayal, the belief that love was a vulnerability, it all turned to dust. Loving her did not make him weak. It made him invincible. It gave him a reason to fight that was more powerful than any crown or kingdom. He reached for her, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You are not my weakness, Nadia," he said, his voice a raw, unbreakable vow that echoed with the power of his soul. "You are my strength, you are my heart, and I will burn this world to ash before I let them harm you." The internal war was over. He had committed his heart as surely as he had committed his armies. He turned to Lucian, his eyes blazing with the promise of righteous retribution. "Prepare the legions," he commanded, his voice ringing with the authority of a king ready to go to war for his queen. "We ride." Chapter 15. The Bait. The castle was a living beast of iron and purpose. The rhythmic stomp of soldiers' boots echoed in the courtyards, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer a constant beat. War was a storm on the horizon, rushing towards them. Silas was a whirlwind of command, consumed by strategy meetings with his generals, his face a grim, focused mask. Amidst the chaos, Nadia felt a strange calm. She spent her days in the infirmary, her quiet, steady hands helping the healers prepare for the wounded to come. She was no longer a ghost, she was a fixture, a quiet source of strength that the others had begun to rely on. One afternoon, she was walking through a corridor on the east wing, a path she knew to be secure. The bond with Silas felt strangely muted, as if shielded by distance and the thick castle walls. A prickling sensation, a whisper of wrongness, crawled up her spine. She rounded a corner and froze. Two hulking wolves in the crimson insignia of the enemy blocked her path. Before she could scream, a third grabbed her from behind, a rough cloth pressed over her mouth. The sweet, sickly smell of a sleeping draft filled her lungs. "Traitors," was her last coherent thought as the world dissolved into blackness, deeper in the walls than we ever knew. She awoke to the biting chill of damp stone and the heavy chafe of iron chains on her wrists. She was in a dark, foul-smelling cell. Alpha Gregor of the Crimson Fang stood before her, his lips curled into a triumphant sneer. "The little queen awakens," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Your king is a fool. He marches his army to our borders as we speak, straight into a trap. And you, my dear, are the bait." He leaned in, his foul breath washing over her. "I will send him a piece of you. A finger, perhaps. He will have a choice. Surrender his army and his crown, or his precious mate dies screaming." Nadia's heart hammered against her ribs. The old her, the ghost girl from Shadow Creek, would have been sobbing, pleading for her life. But that girl was long dead. She had been burned away by betrayal and reforged in the fires of the king's court. She met the enemy Alpha's cruel gaze. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile touched her lips. "You think a finger will be enough to make him surrender?" she asked, her voice a low, chilling whisper that seemed to echo in the small cell. Her gray eyes were as cold and hard as the iron that bound her. "You have no idea what a monster you've just unleashed. He won't surrender his kingdom for me. He will burn yours to the ground." Chapter 16. For her. There was no king. There was only a storm of teeth and claws, a male whose mate had been stolen. The message from Gregor, a crudely severed lock of Nadia's dark hair, had shattered the icy calm of Silas's command. He abandoned his carefully laid battle plans, his strategies, his caution. He was no longer a strategist. He was a weapon, aimed at the heart of his enemy. He took only his most elite warriors, a small, deadly force, and plunged deep into hostile territory on a reckless, desperate mission. The bond was a thin, frayed wire in his mind, a lifeline pulsing with Nadia's fear, but also with a defiant strength that called to his very soul. He found the fortress where they were holding her. It was a trap. Of course it was a trap. Gregor's forces swarmed them, a tide of snarling bodies and flashing steel. The battle was a maelstrom of blood and fury. Silas fought like a demon unleashed, his only thought, his only purpose to reach the tower where he could feel her presence. All thought of his crown, his kingdom, his life. It was all meaningless ash. There was only Nadia. The fear he felt through the bond was a whip, driving him forward. Her defiance was a beacon, pulling him home. He finally understood. A king fought for his kingdom. But a male would die for his mate. He burst through the doors of the cell. She was there, chained to the wall, but her eyes were blazing with a fire that hadn't been broken. Gregor stood beside her, a cruel, gleaming knife held to her throat. For a single, agonizing heartbeat, Silas froze. Gregor smirked, sensing his victory. But in that instant, Nadia acted. She threw her head back, smashing it into Gregor's face, stunning him. It was the only opening Silas needed. He lunged, but the trap had a second layer. As he slammed into Gregor, a hidden guard lunged from the shadows, a silver dagger in his hand. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded in Silas's side. Silver. The poison was instant, a fire that began to devour his strength. With a final savage roar, he ripped Gregor's throat out, but the damage was done. He collapsed to the floor, the world tilting, the edges of his vision going dark. Nadia was there, her chains somehow broken, her hands on his face. He felt her terror, her despair, pour into him through the bond. He fought against the encroaching darkness, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Don't," he gasped, his voice a ragged, bloody whisper. "Don't let them silence you. Ever." His eyes closed, and his hand fell from her cheek, leaving her alone with his dying body in the heart of the enemy's fortress. Chapter 17. The Ghost of a King. They were back at the army's main camp, but there was no victory. There was only the suffocating presence of death. Silas lay in the command tent, his skin ashen, his breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. The silver dagger had been laced with shadowthorn, a rare poison for which there was no common antidote. The healers worked with frantic desperation, but their faces were grim. Hope was a dying ember. Nadia sat beside him, clutching his cold, limp hand. The bond was a faint, flickering pulse, a guttering candle flame about to be extinguished. She felt the old helplessness creeping back in, the familiar chill of being a ghost. The powerful, invincible king was fading before her eyes, and she could do nothing but watch. Outside the tent, she could hear the raised voices of the generals. They were already arguing, vultures circling a dying lion, their fear and ambition warring for control. Lucian entered the tent, his weathered face a mask of profound grief. "There is one last hope, my queen," he said, his voice heavy. "An herb, moon petal. It is the only cure, but it grows only in a secret grove deep in the Whisperwood. It is a 2-day ride. The king, he does not have that much time." A sliver of hope pierced through her despair, but Lucian's next words made it feel like a sliver of ice. "Before he was executed, Lord Valerius confessed everything," Lucian continued, his eyes fixed on Silas's still form. His true master had told him the grove's location. An insurance policy, should things go wrong. Nadia looked at him, confused. His true master? I thought he served Gregor. Lucian's gaze lifted to meet hers. The grief in his eyes was gone, replaced by a chilling, fanatic light. Gregor was a pawn. Valerius served a much greater cause. Our cause. He took a slow step closer, his shadow falling over the cot. A cause that seeks to protect this kingdom from weakness, from an Omega queen who made our king soft. The betrayal was so sudden, so absolute, it was like a physical blow. Lucian, the kind, steady beta who had shown her the letter, who had stood by Silas's side for decades. It was all a lie. "The poison," he said, his voice a low, confessional whisper. "It was always meant for you. His wound was a tragic accident, but it solves the problem either way." He smiled, a cold, terrible expression. "Don't worry, my queen. I will take the throne, and I will tell them all the tragic story of how you died bravely at your king's side." Chapter 18. A Queen's Choice. He had her trapped. Lucian stood before her, the architect of all her pain, his face calm and triumphant. Behind her, Silas was dying. Outside the tent, the army was on the verge of collapse, its generals arguing, blind to the true threat in their midst. The world had shrunk to this single, suffocating moment. "It's over, Nadia," Lucian said, his voice soft, almost kind. It was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. "Surrender. Accept your fate. I will make your end swift, or you can fight me. I will drag your body outside and tell the generals you tried to murder their dying king in a fit of grief. Who do you think they will believe? The loyal beta who has served this kingdom his entire life, or the traitor's daughter?" The choice was a cage. Surrender and be silenced forever, just as her mother had always wanted, or fight and be damned as a murderer. Despair, thick and suffocating, washed over her. He was right. She was powerless. She was alone. Her gaze fell on Silas's face. Even in the gray stillness of near death, he was magnificent. A king. She felt the bond, a tiny flickering spark in the vast, cold darkness, and she remembered his last words, whispered with his final breath. "Don't let them silence you. Ever." It wasn't just a plea. It was a coronation. In his darkest moment, he hadn't thought of his kingdom or his power. He had thought of her voice. He had passed his strength, his will, his belief to her. The fear was still there, a cold snake coiling in her gut. But something else rose to meet it. The fury she'd felt when she learned of her mother's betrayal, the pride she'd felt when she silenced the court, the strength she'd felt when she defied a monster in a dungeon. It all coalesced into a single point of blazing, diamond-hard resolve. She was done being a victim. She was done being a ghost. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting Lucian's. The fear was gone, replaced by an icy calm that made him take a half-step back. "You're right about one thing, Lucian," she said, her voice low and steady. "The king is weak. His heart is failing." She took a deliberate step towards the traitor, her posture radiating an authority she didn't know she possessed. Which is why the army no longer answers to a king. They answer to their queen. Before he could process her words, her impossible audacity, she moved. She snatched the heavy silver water pitcher from the bedside table and swung it with all her might, smashing it against the side of his head. He staggered back, stunned, a look of disbelief on his face. In that same motion, she ripped open the tent flap, revealing the shocked faces of the arguing generals. She did not scream for help. She did not cry. She roared a single command that cracked through the air like a whip. "Treason! Lucian has betrayed the king. Seize him!" Chapter 19. The Queen's Command. The world held its breath. For a long, silent moment, the only sounds in the command tent were the ragged gasps of the dying king and the thud of Nadia's own heart. The generals stared, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Lucian, the great and loyal beta, was on the ground, dazed and bleeding, accused of the highest treason by a girl who, just weeks ago, had no voice at all. A hard-faced general named Kale was the first to find his. "On what grounds do you make this accusation?" he demanded, his voice a low growl of suspicion. "Lucian has been the king's right hand for 50 years. Your word against his—" He didn't need to finish. Her word was nothing. Nadia knew this was the single most important moment of her life. She had no proof. She had no allies. She had only the conviction burning in her soul. She looked past Kale, her gaze sweeping over every powerful alpha in the tent. "The king is dying," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, clear authority that stunned them all into silence. "He was struck down by a poisoned blade meant for me. And this man," she pointed a steady finger at the groaning Lucian, "just offered to grant me a swift death if I surrendered my claim, my voice, and my life to him." She felt the old ghosts trying to rise, the whispers of her mother, the sneers of her pack, the terror of being worthless. She crushed them down. She was not that girl anymore. She walked to the cot where Silas lay, so pale and still, She gently took his hand, the bond a fragile, flickering light. The king's last command to me was to not let them silence me. He knew the betrayal in his own camp ran deeper than any of us imagined. She lifted her chin, meeting Cale's uncertain gaze. I am his mate, his chosen queen. The bond the goddess forged does not lie. My voice is now his voice. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. So I ask you, General, is your loyalty to your king, or is it to the serpent who struck him down? Her words, filled with the undeniable truth of the mate bond, hit their mark. The generals looked at Lucian, who was now scrambling to his feet, sputtering denials that sounded hollow and false. They saw the flicker of guilt, the flash of fanaticism in his eyes. He was a traitor. General Cale's expression hardened into a mask of grim resolve. He gave a single, sharp nod. "The queen has spoken," he barked to his men. "Seize the traitor." As guards swarmed the sputtering Lucian, the deep, resonant thrum of the camp's war drums began to beat. It was not a call to battle against a foreign enemy. It was a call for a reckoning from within, and it was beating for her. Chapter 20. Whispers and Allies. Lucian was in chains, but the army was a wounded and suspicious beast. The traitor had been the king's most trusted advisor, and his poison had spread deep. Many soldiers, particularly those who had served in Lucian's legion, refused to believe it. They saw Nadia as an outsider, a low-born Omega who had somehow bewitched their king and was now making a desperate play for power. The camp was a tinderbox of whispers and paranoia, ready to explode into a bloody civil war. Nadia knew that a queen's command was not enough. She had to win their trust, not just demand their obedience. She summoned the remaining generals, not to the intimidating command tent, but to the infirmary. Surrounded by the scent of antiseptic herbs and the quiet groans of the wounded, she spoke to them. She didn't give orders. She pieced together a story, connecting the small details she had observed, the way Lucian had held back their fastest riders during the initial search, the strange patrol routes that had left the east wing of the castle undefended on the day of her capture. She laid out a dangerous plan. Lucian's second-in-command, a stern and fiercely loyal alpha named Vorlag, was the key to shattering the conspiracy. Nadia arranged for a captured Crimson Fang warrior, one who knew the truth of Lucian's alliance, to stage a daring escape. She gambled that the warrior would run straight to Vorlag for protection. General Cal and his most loyal soldiers would be hidden, waiting and watching. This was a battle of shadows and whispers, a quiet war of wits and observation. It was the kind of fight the ghost girl from Shadow Creek had been training for her entire life. She was not a general who could win with a sword. She would win with the truth. As she waited, she felt the faint, steady pulse of the bond with Silas. It was a weak warmth in the back of her mind, a silent encouragement that gave her strength. The plan worked perfectly. That night, under a sliver of moon, Vorlag met the escaped prisoner near the edge of the woods. The prisoner begged for help, babbling about the secret alliance with Lucian. Vorlag's face was grim. He glanced around, and then, believing they were alone, he drew his dagger. "You know too much," he snarled, moving to silence the man forever. "So do you," General Kyle said, stepping out from the shadows, his soldiers emerging from the trees with their swords drawn. The capture of Vorlag was the blow that broke the conspiracy. The truth, now undeniable, swept through the camp like a cleansing fire. One by one, the wavering soldiers and their captains came to her tent, bending the knee not just to the king's mate, but to the cunning, brilliant strategist who had just saved them from tearing each other apart. The army was hers now, truly hers, but it would all be for nothing if her king died. Chapter 21. A Queen's Justice. Nadia stood before the dark tent where they held Lucian. The army was hers, but her heart was a cold, tight knot of fear. Silas was fading. She was running out of time. She entered the tent alone. Lucian was chained to a post, his face bruised, but his eyes were filled with an arrogant, unrepentant hatred. "So, the little mouse has learned to roar," he sneered. It doesn't matter. You've lost. He is dying, and his army will not follow a worthless Omega for long." Nadia ignored the insult. It had no power over her anymore. "He needs the moon petal," she said, her voice calm and level. "You will tell me where to find the grove." Lucian laughed, a harsh, grating sound that scraped against the silence. "And why would I save the man who let himself be weakened by a stray like you? I would rather watch this kingdom burn than see it in your hands." "You think love is a weakness," Nadia said, her voice soft, yet carrying an immense weight. "My mother thought that too. She believed power was something you could buy with gold. You believe it is something you can take with a sword. You are both fools." She took a step closer, her shadow falling over him. "True power isn't about what you can take for yourself. It's about what you're willing to fight to protect." "Tell me where the grove is, Lucian," she commanded. "Never," he spat. A cold, hard light entered Nadia's eyes. "Good," she said, the single word making the powerful Alpha flinch. "Then you can guide us." She turned to the 2 guards standing at the entrance. "Chain him. Bind him to the front of a horse. He will lead a party of my 20 best riders into the Whisperwood if he leads us into a trap, if he tries to flee, or if the king's heart stops beating before we return." She paused, her gaze locking with Lucian's. "Leave his body for the crows." The arrogance in Lucian's eyes finally shattered, replaced by a dawning, stark terror. She was not making a threat. She was passing a sentence. She was not a grieving mate. She was a queen delivering justice. As the guards hauled the struggling traitor to his feet, a sound, faint as a sigh, drifted from the command tent next door. "Nadia?" It was Silas. His eyes were open, just a fraction. He was barely conscious, but he had heard her. He had seen her, and he was with her. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She turned away from the traitor, her heart set on the desperate mission ahead, ready to ride into the darkness to save her king. Chapter 22. A Traitor's End. They returned from the Whisperwood not just with an antidote, but with a victory. Silas was alive. He was weak, the poison having left its mark, but the healers promised a full recovery. The kingdom had been saved, but justice had not yet been served. The entire army was assembled in the main clearing, a sea of solemn, hardened faces. In the center, on a makeshift platform, stood Lucian. He was chained, his face bruised, his fine clothes torn, but his eyes still burned with a defiant, bitter hatred. Silas stood at the edge of the platform, leaning on General Kale for support. He was pale, but his presence was an undeniable weight, a silent testament to his survival. He looked at Nadia, his golden eyes conveying a message deeper than words. "This is yours. You earned this." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This was her judgment to deliver. Nadia stepped onto the platform, her simple woolen dress a stark contrast to the shining armor of the soldiers around her. She faced the traitor, the wolf who had been a kind friend and a monstrous enemy. "You have won nothing," Lucian spat, his voice dripping with venom. "The army will not follow an Omega. You are a weakness, a disease that will rot this kingdom from the inside out." Nadia looked away from him, her gaze sweeping over the thousands of wolves watching her. These were the same soldiers who had once whispered about the traitor's daughter. Now they watched her with a fierce, unwavering respect. She felt the bond, a strong, steady river of love and support flowing from Silas, anchoring her. She was not a weakness. She was a queen. "You are wrong," Nadia said, her voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the clearing. "You talk of strength, but you only understand fear. You talk of lineage, but you know nothing of loyalty." She turned back to Lucian, her gray eyes as hard as flint. "A true pack is a family. You betrayed your king. You betrayed your people. You betrayed your family. There is only one sentence for such a crime." She did not need to say the words. Silas, pushing himself away from his general's support, took a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice, though strained, rang with the absolute authority of a king. For high treason against the crown and the queen, the sentence is death. He held out a ceremonial dagger, its obsidian blade gleaming in the sunlight, but he did not point it at the traitor. He held it out, hilt first, to Nadia. She took it. The weight was familiar, balanced. It was her right, her duty, not as a grieving mate, but as a ruler. She stepped forward and delivered the finishing blow, not with anger, but with the cold, clean finality of justice. As the traitor fell, the crowd did not cheer, they roared. It was the sound of a kingdom and a queen being born. Chapter 23. Scars and Sunlight. Weeks later, the castle no longer smelled of fear and war, but of beeswax and fresh bread. Silas stood by the window of his study, watching the sunlight dapple the gardens below. His side still ached, a dull, throbbing reminder of how close he had come to the edge of darkness. The physical wound would leave a scar. But the older wounds, the ones that had festered in his soul for years, were finally healing. The ghost of his first mate's betrayal no longer had any power over him. He turned his gaze back into the room. Nadia was at the great council table, speaking with the lords and generals. The same wolves who had once scorned her now leaned forward, listening to every word she said. She spoke not of conquests and power, but of rebuilding trade routes, of fostering alliances, of ensuring the smaller packs had enough to survive the coming winter. She had an empathy, a quiet wisdom born from a life spent in the shadows that he had never possessed. She was not just a warrior queen. She was a nurturer, a builder. A profound, unfamiliar peace settled over him. For his entire reign, he had believed love was a liability. He had ruled with an iron fist, convinced that vulnerability was a flaw that would lead to his downfall. He had been a fool. Nadia had saved him, not just with a magical herb, but with her courage, her defiance, her unwavering heart. She had shown him that true strength was not the absence of weakness, but the courage to love in spite of it. She finished speaking, and the entire council rose to their feet in a thunderous show of respect and support. She turned, her eyes scanning the room, and when she saw him standing by the window, a brilliant, radiant smile lit up her face. It was a smile meant only for him, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was completely, utterly, and irrevocably in love. Later that evening, she came to him as he stood before the fire. She came up beside him, her small hand gently tracing the new silver scar on his side. "Does it still hurt?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. "No," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. He covered her hand with his, pressing it against his skin. "It's a reminder." A reminder of what? He turned to face her, looking deep into her stormy gray eyes. "That my heart is no longer inside my chest," he said softly. "It's yours." He drew her in for a slow, tender kiss, a promise of a future he had never dared to dream of. The kingdom was safe. The war was over. Now their life could begin. Chapter 24. The Queen of Storm and Sky. The day of the coronation was bright and clear. The great hall, once a place of shadows and fear, was now filled with sunlight and joyous celebration. Nadia stood before a tall silver mirror, looking at a reflection she barely recognized. A woman stood there, her eyes clear and confident, her shoulders straight. She was wearing a gown of shimmering silver silk, the color of a calm morning sky. She was no longer the ghost girl in dishwater gray. She touched the mating mark on her neck. It was not a brand of ownership. It was the final, beautiful scar from her long journey home. Silas came to stand behind her. Dressed in his formal black and silver regalia, he was every inch the magnificent Alpha King. He met her gaze in the mirror, and his golden eyes were soft with a love so profound, it still made her breath catch in her throat. "Are you ready, my love?" he murmured. A true smile touched her lips. "I was always ready," she replied. She had never been weak. She had just been waiting for a reason to be strong. They walked down the great hall's central aisle together, hand in hand. They were not king and his consort. They were partners, equals. The assembled lords and ladies, the common folk, the soldiers. They all bowed as one, a silent, powerful wave of love and respect. Two thrones, carved from the same ancient heartwood, sat side by side upon the dais. Silas stepped up first and took his crown, the heavy, formidable iron circlet of the Alpha King. Then, he picked up the second crown. It was a delicate, beautiful thing, crafted from woven silver and dotted with moonstones that seemed to glow with their own inner light. He turned to her. But he did not move to place the crown upon her head. Instead, he held it out to her in his open palms. It was a silent testament to everything they had learned. Power is not given. A crown is not bestowed. It must be claimed. With a steady hand, Nadia took the crown. She held it up for all to see, a symbol of her journey, her survival, her victory. Then, with all the grace and authority of the ruler she had become, she placed it upon her own head. The hall exploded. A single, unified roar of love and loyalty filled the space, the people chanting her name. "Queen Nadia! Queen Nadia!" Silas's face was alight with a brilliant, unrestrained joy. He leaned in and kissed her, not with the fire of their first kiss, but with the deep, steady warmth of a love that would last an eternity. "My queen," he whispered against her lips. "My king," she whispered back. They turned to face their people. 2 crowns, 2 rulers, 1 heart. The silent Omega was a ghost of the past. In her place stood Nadia, the queen of storm and sky, ready to rule a kingdom built not on fear, but on a love that had been forged in the heart of the fire.